morning. My pleasure. Go ahead.
If you're ready, I'll introduce.
Sure.
Good morning and welcome once again to a new season of Christian Formation. This season's theme is finding our place in God's story, and I love that theme. I love especially that we're starting with someone who is very much a part of our story, so very apropos that we have with us Dr. Rob Elsner, who is the Dean of the Psychology Department at Samford. Chair, sorry, I'm
Don't
so
elevate
sorry.
me.
And not head, but chair. Learning. Of the Psychology Department at Samford, and of course, very much part of our story, especially this last year, helping us to heal and to learn from our faith. Today, it's stories of faith, hope, and love with faith, psychology, and my favorite, action. So, thank you very much for sharing with us today.
Thank you, Sheila. I appreciate it. Well, welcome. Good morning. It's always a nice thing to be asked to present and share a little bit. I am chair of psychology, but I'm not a counselor. Though many of you in here have known me as a counselor here because that's what we needed a year ago, and that Thursday night that kind of started. It had unfortunately been 40 years since I was trained in counseling, so a little bit rusty on it, but we get through together, and that's a part of today's presentation, is getting through together and sharing our stories. I will begin by prefacing, I just had eye surgery. So when I teach people how to teach, I remind them never turn around and look at that screen. It shows how unprofessional and that you don't know your stuff. But unfortunately, I just had eye surgery and I can't see out of this eye yet, so I will sometimes peek around to make sure I know what I'm saying and where I am. Which is also part of my story, knowing where I am, knowing who I am. And I'd like to share a little bit about a narrative technique that we use in psychology that we have used here in this parish. Many of you have a copy of the book that was done by people involved in the shooting last year that helped as a therapeutic modality, a way that we deal with things. And it's a part of the great longevity of the Christian experience, is writing and sharing from those people who sat around the same dinner table and all had different stories, and those stories we call the Gospels. Even though 4 different people, they hear most of the same stuff, but some that's different. And if you imagine yourself going over someone's house and having a dinner party, and the next day someone says, well, what happened at the party? And you tell your story, and then they go to your best friend who was there, or your spouse, or whomever else. Their story will have similarities, but great differences. Because what you're attending to, what matters most to you, that's because we're individuals. We are unique and absolutely beloved in the eyes of God. And that has to come through in the narratives that we share. So I want to face up here, as so inappropriate, unprofessional, but I'm going to face the screen here a little bit, and ask you the question, who are you? When I teach general psychology, Psych 101, it's one of my favorite questions to ask and absolutely distress students. Gets them really worked up because most of them have never really asked that question before. They've been asked certain attributes. What is your name? What is your class? What is your major? What is, your parents' socioeconomic status, because we're in private university. We don't always ask what really makes you you, what makes you special, what makes you an individual and this unique and beloved child of God. we tend to answer with these things like the name, occupation, the civic descriptors, the family history. When my wife and I first met, one of those questions that got me was, I was asked by her grandmother, "Who are your people?" "We were a proud people. We sailed the..." Oh, wait. What does that mean? Who are your people? Well, it's who you really have been. What made you you? What are the dynamics? What brought you to this place? The idea of what stage in life are you? How many of us really know how to answer that? I'm a gerontologist. I've been working with people over 100 years of age for 30 years. What stage of life are they in when you ask them? Most of them are like, "Well, I know I'm 120, but I feel 21 inside." Like, tell me more about this story of your life and the different parts of their lives as they see them. We tend to talk about our religious persuasion, but even that, as Episcopalians, sometimes we're not real keen on. We should never be embarrassed by our faith. We shouldn't worry that someone else might have a different faith, because that's the beauty of our relationship with God. We know that we are beloved, and they are too. And we might have disagreements. That doesn't make us, have to be jerks, have to repulse people. The warm embrace of the gospel is an important part for us. And unfortunately, we sometimes don't use the same language. So we might use a term like political affiliation and not realize we don't always understand what someone else is saying, and we might be saying the exact same thing but using slightly different words, or we might be using exactly the same words and meaning vastly different things. And all of that is part of storytelling, understanding commonalities, understanding different features, and understanding where they go wrong. So I will ask you, who are you? How many of you have ever faced this question in depth? I see 3 hands. Wow. The rest of you are either extremely fortunate or liars. Oh, no. Or not really able to talk about it, willing, because sometimes we're afraid that our narrative might be called out. We might be asked, share your story. If you've wrestled with your story, do you want to share your story? Or is there that protective wall that we sometimes build, even amongst people with whom we should be absolutely honest and forthright, like our church family? I sometimes ask people how they define themselves. Asking a group of first-year college students how they define themselves is glorious. Because most of the time they cannot figure out, and they really way overshare sometimes, and like, do your parents know that? It's like, does your boyfriend, girlfriend, it friend know that? I mean, I don't know what terms, and I'm trying to learn and be loving and kind. Share with me, teach me, help me understand. Define yourself as you know yourself so that I can be more loving and kind. And that's a great way we have to think about it. When I taught at Wake Forest University, in the School of Medicine, we had a fabulous center, and it was funded and founded by Maya Angelou, if any of you know who that is. And the first day of my appointment at that center as well, it's a cross appointment, I had 3 cross appointments, this unbelievably imposing woman sits down right across the table from me. And I know who she is, and she had the famous pearls on. She was quite famous for her string of pearls. And she asked a question that I had never been asked before, and it really disturbed me. What was not spoken about at your breakfast table? What could you never, ever discuss at dinner with your family? That defines you as much, if not more, than all these other descriptors we've been talking about? What do you avoid discussing? What are your greatest fears of discussing, of being identified by? What are the horrors of family that sometimes have to be talked about, but we don't? And this set me on a course of questioning both myself and everyone else, because if you've met me, I ask questions. I ask obnoxious questions at times, especially in the church. Many of you in this room, as I look out, and I can sort of see you because this eye is still okay. This one, surgery, but this one, okay. I've asked many of you in this room, do you have a favorite Bible verse? If so, what is that favorite verse of the Bible? And then sometimes I'm really a big jerk and ask why. Why is that your favorite verse? Because that's one of those intimacies, one of those ways we really get to know one another, either from the greatest fear or the fear alleviation, how we are set at peace, or how we are challenged to actually be loving and kind to one another. A new commandment I give you, love one another as I have loved you, doesn't always resonate with us, but it should. It is supposed to. It has to if we are to be who we say. And there are times where we need to think about what we say in transience versus in permanence. In, I think it was the early 1990s, late 1980s, in the New Yorker, there was a fantastic cartoon, and it had two people coming out of a theater, and this one person was saying to the other, that's what I adore about the ephemeral nature of theater. You never have to experience that same garbage again. And I was reminded of this when I preached at a church in South Carolina. For 3 years, I had the pulpit at Trinity Episcopal Church in Abbeville, where the Civil War kind of started and ended legally, because that's where the Articles of Confederation were signed, the Articles of Dissolution were signed. And before they signed them over in the Burt Stark Mansion, they went over to Trinity Church and prayed together and asked God, are we doing the right thing? Lead us. They were trying to be faithful, and we don't always hear that in our narrative. But it's a really interesting part, especially for us in the Episcopal Church, that we were part of the story of people trying to do what's right, even if we might disagree with what they did. They were trying. That unbelievably important idea. If you didn't notice, I put quotes up here that I'm not going to read to you because most of you can read unless you also just had eye surgery, in which case, but this question about who you are, we sometimes don't want to know fully who we are, and sometimes when we are talking with people, we change who we are. And that is normal. That is common. That is an aspect of humanity. There is something called a chameleon effect, which most of us, if you get down to it, succumb to. If we are in a new place, we want to fit in. I watch this every year at the university because students come in, and when they're moving in, they might be moving in wearing a t-shirt that says Alabama or Auburn, and then they're moving on to the Samford campus, and within the next day, Samford. Then football season runs around, and it's all over the place because allegiances, and we don't ask that. Haven't seen any Duke shirts, but there might be soon, you know? This idea of who we are changes sometimes. And it's not that it's a lack of integrity, it's more this idea of fitting in at that moment, at that time, because we want people to see us as non-threatening. We want to see people as accepting us. We have something in common. You walk into an Episcopal church anywhere in the world, well, Anglican church, you know what I mean, part of the Anglican communion, anywhere in the world, and you're going to see a sign that says something similar to the Episcopal Church welcomes you. The Church of Ireland loves you and welcomes you, which I think is a tiny bit better even, but this idea of who we are, And the chameleon effect, some people say there are times where we want to be a better person, so we go places that are going to hold us to better standards, like our churches, which is why there's sometimes some issue within a lot of us. What makes us better, and how do we discuss that? Our narratives are sometimes different. And the other aspect that we find is the imposter syndrome. So many people are always afraid, well, what if they found out I'm not as good as they think I am? What if they find out I'm not as smart as they think I am? What if I'm not? What if I'm not? What if I'm not? It's an imposter syndrome. I had an acquaintance, just leave it at that, who was a neurosurgeon. And she had been a neurosurgeon for 20-something years, unbelievably brilliant, never said oops during a surgery, which brain surgery, that's the defining moment. If you say oops during brain surgery, something just got lost. Never said oops during brain surgery, which makes her one of the best neurosurgeons around. And we had a discussion when her father died, and she said, I was always afraid I was going to do something wrong and show him that I wasn't as amazing as he thought I was. Wow, you're world-renowned as being a great neurosurgeon, but you still are afraid that you're not up to the task? Really? The rest of us face this too, very often. In churches, it's one of those reasons why there are certain words, like the words of assurance that we love so much, that tell us, God loves us. It's okay if you're not perfect. You don't have to be. That's okay. But when we start asking the questions of, but my story, it's not right, it's not perfect, it's not great, it's not filled with wonders, it's filled with issues and problems and failures. And you know what? So are all the others. How do we relate those failures? What do we do with those failures? Do they define us in bono or in malo? In the good, for our good, or for our destruction, for our diminution? Do they enhance us? I have failed at so many things in my life, it is unbelievable. And one of the defining aspects of me is I try and take those failures and not fail the same way again. Sometimes I do, because I'm kind of stupid sometimes, but the overall part of my narrative is learning from my failure. So I set up a system for students that I want them to occasionally fail, but the stakes be really low when they fail, so that when the stakes are higher, they don't fail. They have learned from it with little cost. Here in the church, that's part of the narrative of the Bible, is so that you can learn from the stories that we tell, from the histories, from the failures. I adore many of the apostles. I really love St. Peter. You want to talk about a failure? St. Peter redefines failure, but that's not what he's remembered for. He's remembered for building, for doing great stuff. I am a Johannine. I have studied John with some of the finest Johannine scholars in the world, and I love John. And John too failed, and John too did things not quite right. Not to the same level as Peter, mind you, but at the same time, he learned from his failure. And they chronicled their failures. They chronicled so that they could share with other people, so that you didn't think that they were like Jesus, that they were perfect, because you're not, and that's partly why you're so beloved by God. How we learn from this. So, this idea of the social desirability, if we didn't overcome it, we wouldn't have the Gospels, we wouldn't have the epistles, we wouldn't have the possibility of redemption, we wouldn't have the understanding of sin and forgiveness and being embraced and the beauty of it. No one expects you to be perfect. We expect you to try and do better. Jesus' term was, go and sin no more. That's where we as the Episcopal Church break into more of a discussion than some of the others in discussing what is sin and what does it really mean, and let's parse the Hebrew and the Greek so that we understand it properly, not just throw people into a rubbish bin of history. Because most of it comes down to this great question of narrative. When you tell your story, how are you related in your story to God? Is God a central figure of the story of your life? And if not, the question is, why not? What do you got against God? No, he's kind of a big deal. And our understanding of writing out our stories sometimes is important. Throughout human history, people have written in order to deal with the issues of their lives. Tolstoy made a comment that I love, and it's a mistranslation, but I love it, that he said effectively every great writer is an armchair psychologist. He didn't use those terms because those terms weren't really in vogue yet, but it's a fabulous way to think about it. Great writers speak to the human condition. Great writers share about their lives and their relationships with other people, their relationships within themselves, and quite often with their relationship with God. Even if they are ardent atheists, that is still an expression of their relationship with God. Richard Dawkins was once in a bad car wreck, and he is a famous atheist. And as the other car was hitting, the person driving quoted him as saying, "Oh my God!" Richard, do you understand what the term atheist means? So we have to think about our personal narratives here. This idea of writing down, sharing, speaking out loud, even if it's in the quiet of the paper scratch. The scratch of pen on paper is still speaking out loud. That is an important reality for us. If we look here, in the 1800s, there was formalized study of what was actually happening, and that kind of reached its head with a lot of the great personality tests of the late 1800s, early 1900s. My personal favorite is not Rorschach, by the way. My personal favorite is something called the thematic apperception test. Murray and Morgan, 1935. You want to look it up? It's super fun. But what it is, and I actually have students do this, they turned in their assignments last week, was they look at a picture or a painting, a photograph, doesn't matter, that is ambiguous. And from an ambiguous picture, I have them tell a story, and they have to name the people in it, and they have to tell me the circumstance, and they have to tell me the background and what's about to happen. That's the assignment. And then at the end of the semester, they have to look back at those stories that they have submitted and I have downloaded so they can't change them, and they have to analyze them. And they have to approach what is happening in their life, including their relationship with God. And our writings are so important to us. If I have you write a story of this morning, what did you do up until that point where you took a really nice nap during Sunday school? Will it show your relationship to other people? Will it show your relationship to God? And if it doesn't, why not? Or how does it not? We show what separates us from other people in our stories. Sometimes it's using terms like protagonist. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's rehashing the same story in 50 different ways. Since I have not been able to really read, pecking this thing out on the computer, this presentation was a little difficult because of the visual difficulties I'm facing right now, post-surgery. But it was fun because I just can't really read at the moment. And I usually read thousands of pages every week. So I've been watching shows, and I'm not a TV guy. And I saw on Amazon there is one of my favorite books from years ago called The Wheel of Time series. And they've made it into a high-end, great production value series. And it's not like the books. Oh well, none of them ever are. But in there, it was really fun because there were so many things that I was like, oh, I remember Rowling's used that in Harry Potter. Oh, Rowling's used that. She used that in Harry Potter too. Oh. And the narratives started to flow together. And then I got a little tired because it didn't have the trueness to the book, so I switched over to another, in a BBC production of Earthsea, if any of you have ever read that. Another classic sci-fi fantasy series, which I'm a geek, yeah, I know. And again, I was like, oh, that is the Harry Potter story. It's the kid who finds he has magic, goes off to a magical school. Oh, wait, those professors are exactly, that's Dumbledore. The whole thing. That's the beauty of it, is that the story was based on other stories, and all the best stories are based on preceding stories. Fluffy the Three-Headed Dog, J.K. Rowling, that's Cerberus, who guards the gates of hell from Roman mythology. If we know each other's narratives, we know our own narratives. The more we share these narratives, the more we enjoy these narratives, and the more meaningful they can become, because we give allowances for ourselves as well as for other people. We give allowances for our failures, and we give commendations for the growth and the overcoming the challenges and the obstacles. We allow ourselves to break through the problems. Sorry, I'm having microphone problems. Not quite wardrobe malfunction, but it's close. So we go through and we start thinking about what it is with writing. We start to think through, when you are writing, you may surprise yourself because you may tell a story that you did not realize was your story. I've had people write their stories so many times over the decades, and quite often I hear that, I have no idea why I wrote that. You just asked said the perfect statement to ask a question for me. Why did you write that? Let's explore that. Let's see why. What is it in your relationship with each other, with God, with yourself? Where are your chameleon effects? Where are your imposter effects that you are really struggling with? And that's where the greatest literature comes in, but it's also where the most efficacious writing of an individual comes from. When we are reading the Bible, do you find yourself drawn towards the same genre all the time? I've mentioned I'm a Johannine. I love reading John, the gospel, which is, shallow enough for a baby to wade in, but deep enough for an elephant to drown in. But I also love the letters. Those Johannine letters, to me, are some of the ultimate love letters of God to human race. They're love letters. They are beautiful. But there's also Revelation, which in the Episcopal Church, we don't study that one. We were in Greenwood, South Carolina, and I was teaching a Sunday school on Revelation, and the bishop walked in. There was, 50-something people in the parlor for Sunday school, and he was like, I was looking for the adult Sunday school. You found it. But there are a lot of people. Yes. What book are you reading? Revelation. Really? What book about Revelation? I said, the Revelation of Jesus Christ according to St. John. And it was so unusual for us to actually read a Bible book, this library we call the Bible. And these things, we're drawn to different ones. And if you only read the same genre all the time, if it's always Song of Solomon, by the way, I have a clinical colleague who can help you. We can get you the help that you really need. But it's special poetry. But we start to find the beauty of all of these genres, and which genre you are most drawn to helps. I am a sci-fi fantasy geek. I love that as a genre. That doesn't mean I have not read all of the greats. I have read almost all of the great literature of the world in translation because I'm linguistically an idiot. But I love that because there is hopefulness. There is a utopian grasp of everything's going to work out. Kind of like in the Bible. We start off at the very beginning by telling you the very end. God wins. God loves you. God so loved the world. We start off with the end so that we don't have to worry about it. And we start getting drawn into the beauty of it. When you read a book that you have read before, you're going back to have a conversation with this friend of a book. With this friend, this comfortable, wonderful friend who you know so well. And as you make friends with people, you notice that there is more comfort. There are expectations, and there are also sometimes some things that, don't talk about with that friend. That's a good thing. We need to think about our writing as why, when children are young, we are told to write in a diary and start with Dear Diary. Have you ever thought about why people start with Dear Diary? It's so that we have that focus on person, on a personal narrative and a personal responsibility, because when we share with another person, we look them in the eye, we know we are seeing into the eyes of another person beloved by God. And by saying Dear Diary, we are building a new person that we are taking that responsibility with. Because when you read out loud is different. Any of you who have been lecterns, if you have been a lector in church and you have read, it's very different. You can read and you sit there, the names don't bother you from the Old Testament, and then you get up in front of a couple hundred people in church and words no work good. It's a very difficult thing for a lot of people. When you say Dear Diary, you are imposing responsibility upon yourself. You are asking someone to listen, even if it is the ether, even if it is just God. Just God is a dangerous statement, by the way, but we're going to let that one slide. This whole understanding, we are sometimes able to write what we are afraid to say. We are sometimes able to write what we could never say to another person. 40 years ago, I worked for the Orange County Rape Crisis Center, and it was a common thing for the clinicians there to teach the clients to write out parts of their story and then just burn it. And that part of the story is over. Write the worst parts that you can't stand to remember. Just destroy it. Let go of it. But deal with it. Write it out so that you have spoken words that are so difficult for you to speak, ideas that are so horrible, and then just move past. And not everyone can move past, by the way. It's a very difficult thing, and I'm making it sound like, it's an easy. But it's a very difficult thing, but it's a one step in a process. We also think about what we are allowed to write, what is socially acceptable for us to write. And we sometimes need to move past that in order to gain an insight into ourselves and into what truth is for us. The idea of who you are as a writer, don't worry about being a good writer. Worry about being an honest writer. Worry about being true to yourself. If you've ever read Peer Gynt, Ibsen makes the statement that trolls live forever because they are not stupid enough to try and live unto thine own self be true, unto thine own self be enough. And that's why they live for hundreds of years, and they don't have anxiety attacks, and they don't have the problems that humans have. But we want to live unto thine own self be true. We want to, and when we write it, we need to do that. One of the ways that I want you to think about this, and if you leave here with one thing, it's this. What you say out loud can influence your mood and your cognition and your memory. Velten came up with this technique, 1970s is when it became really popular, and he put forward 60 statements, either positive, neutral, or negative. And you're required to say them out loud to other people. One other person, out loud to a camera, doesn't really matter. Say them out loud. And that it does, in fact, change your mood. And I want you to think about this. I'd like you to play along with me. Okay, audience participation time. I would like you to actually say these out loud, read these out loud, unless you have eye surgery recently, in which case you're exempt, okay, just like I am. And Velten's work started a lot of daily affirmation and self-affirmation work that doesn't always do as well. But it's a very small change, but any change is impactful. When you are writing some of these things, it's like speaking out loud. When you are writing your thoughts, your fears, your hopes, your dreams, it's like speaking to another person, and it can affect us inside. It can change how we approach the world. It sometimes changes how we approach our relationship with God and letting God in instead of trying to force God out of our lives. See why I saved that one? I really want you to think through the great joys of it. The people who are the Saturday Night Live put it Debbie Downers, if you remember Debbie Downer. Those who say the Debbie Downer things all the time tend to live the more miserable lives. Those people that you admire most are the ones that try and say the positives, look for the positives. They're not always the ones writing the positives, though. Through the writing, they're able to deal with it such that they can consider how they're reaching out into the world. Because we need to understand the great difficulties of our lives, and we need to understand God's role in our lives, whether we want it to be there or not. In any kind of traumatic situation, we do have to think about writing. Those of you in the room who wrote for the book that we did here, most of the people that I've spoken with have said that they found it incredibly cathartic, that they were able to release, that they were able to not have to relive because they wrote it. And once it is spoken and done. It's not something we're worrying about. Kind of like if you're at work and you have to have a talk with an employee or with a boss or whatever, and you plan it and you replan it and you dream about it and you worry about it, and then it's over with and it's like, oh, it's done. It's released. I have lived through it. I am still alive. The world did not crash. The sky did not fall. God did not in fiery letters write, I hate you, or anything like that in the sky. You are still beloved. When we write, we sometimes are able to release really, really well. Because there are times where we don't know how to write, and just taking the pen in a hand or sitting down at the keyboard. CJ. Oh, I'm sorry, Mary B. I totally have a visual thing. I see collar. Yes. Incorporated into a new you, yeah. No. How do we assimilate it? How do we use it to strengthen us? Because, we talk about it so often as the analogy of grafting or as pruning. Those are the two. And grafting is putting something artificial into us to grow, but it's what is grafted that tends to bear the fruit. And we forget that the tree or the vine is still there with something else grafted on. When we talk about pruning, we sometimes talk about the direct loss, and because something has been pruned, the rest can grow more fertile, more lush, more green, whatever it is. But that also doesn't say there is still a memory of that vine. There is still a memory. Those of us who have lost people we love, and most of us have lost people we love, we will always face that. Every September 22nd, I will remember my mother because that was her birthday. And all these years she's been dead, she is still a part of me. And the beauty and the pain are all a part of who I am. So it's a wonderful point, Mary B. We go through and we start thinking more about this writing, the redefinition, the concept of sharing. And I want to encourage you to write more. I want you to think through the issues of truth and context. My favorite quote by Herodotus here, context is king. Technically, the translation would be better as either culture or custom, but my translation is better, I think. But it's fine. Context is king. What we are writing, how we are thinking through what is there, how we are promoting the particulars of a narrative such that healing occurs, growth occurs. We are strengthened in our core. And at our core, if there is not a core of faith in ourselves, in God, and then that relationship between the two, then there can't be the relationships elsewhere. They're weak. That strength has to start with knowing who you are. You can't depend on someone else being your definition of yourself. God has to be there. I think each and every one of us that has ever tried to write anything personal knows that there are difficulties, and sometimes there are fears of what's going to happen when other people read our writing. You don't ever have to share what you write, but I always recommend that you do write. And more importantly than writing sometimes is reading. Read, read, and read. Read the great stories of humanity, and this greatest story ever told, of course, being a big part of it. But it also requires the courage to write. Writing is action, period. Writing is action about action. Writing is action about action of our lives, either as they are, were, want to be, dreams, fears, but they are telling who we are as we write. Even if it's a fantasy novel you're writing, you are writing about yourself. Even if it's just, I went to the store today, Betsy asked me to buy milk, and I forgot the milk. But I did buy 50 other things that I started thinking about as I went to the store. That is my narrative. Not that I do it much, but sometimes. And do remember that once you know a thing, you can't unknow a thing. Once you see the hidden picture in the maze, you can't unsee it. Once you know what the words of the song actually are, you can't unhear them. Even if it's Louie, Louie that no one knows the words for, even the people singing it. Once you know a thing, you can't unknow it. The most important things for you to know are the things that God loves you, we love you, and help yourselves and each other by writing and knowing who you truly are, who you want to be. It takes a lot to stop change in the world. It takes a lot to stop growth, and nothing in the world can stop the growth of your relationship with God and your understanding of yourself. And that's the big take-home point that hopefully will be written in the stories of your lives. Thank you. Sheila?